So I'd like to say something first about this picture, this painting. It's appropriate for today, I think, because it depicts the Buddha and Ananda, his attendant, as elderly men. And today, as we're talking about the Buddha as in the last days of the Buddha, so that could be something what he looked like. It's a painting hanging in the Birmingham Buddhist Centre, and that's a copy of that, which is rather lovely, I think. It's probably what it sort of approaches what he probably looked like, rather than the sort of well, he certainly wasn't gold. He certainly didn't have things sticking out the top. All that sort of stuff. That was a sort of realistic type of image of what the Buddha actually looked like. So I thought it was appropriate for today. The Buddha and Ananda as elderly gentlemen. Okay, so yeah, as Dayasara said, what is Parinivana? So I'm going to say a little bit about that. The account of the Buddha's last days, last weeks, last months, is given in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. And that's in Pali. Nirvana is Sanskrit, Nibbana is Pali. I don't want to confuse you too much, but the account of the Buddha's last months and what have you is given in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. There is a Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which is a later Mahayana work, which is, I think it vaguely mentions that the Buddha died, and then it's a sort of the rest of it is a sort of product of a very fertile imagination. It's quite an important text in Chinese Buddhism, I think. But as far as we're concerned, we'll be looking and quoting from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. And you often see the misspelling of Parinibbana as Paranibbana or Parinirvana, which I suppose is not surprising, because pari is a sort of an unusual prefix, isn't it? You get sort of parachute, parasite, paramananda. You know, we're much more familiar with it with para, so it sometimes gets misspelt, but it's pari. And pari means complete, supreme or complete enlightenment, or awakening or nirvana. So before I say anything about parinirvana, I'll stick to the word nirvana because it's more familiar. I'll just say something about nirvana. Very, very difficult to describe exactly what it is. It's the state of an enlightened being described by unenlightened beings. Very difficult to do that. And also, I came across a book which lists 58 different terms for nirvana or awakening. You know, the deathless, the island, the beyond, the uncreated, liberation, etc., etc. So there's lots of terms, but I think awakened is quite a good one, because, as most of you probably know, the Buddha is not a name in the sense of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or anything like that. It's a title meaning one who is awake. So awakened is quite a good term for the Buddha, awakened being. So what is nirvana then? I'll stick to nirvana, as I said. So the etymology, the source of the term, literally means blowing out. Nir is a negative, and va refers to the verb to blow. So it's a blowing out. That's what it means literally. So what's being blown out here? It's the three fires of greed, hatred, and delusion, the three major defilements and secondary defilements that associate or emanate from these primary defilements. So it means a blowing out. Now, we often these days talk greed, hatred, and delusion as the three poisons. But originally, they were known in early Buddhism as the three fires. And the Buddha used to use sort of common knowledge or terms people used. And at the time, there was one of the major beliefs or religions in India at the time of the Buddha was Brahmanism. And strict Brahmins used to have 3 fires burning in their house perpetually. And so he related this idea of the blowing out of the fires, the 3 fires of greed, hatred and illusion. It sort of later got translated into Sanskrit and then back again, and the symbolism of fire kind of got lost, so they became known as the 3 poisons. But you can look at it as a blowing out, and it's quite an important way that the Buddha spoke, was as relating things to fire. It was sort of an analogy he used quite a lot. So it's not an easy question or an easy task to describe what nirvana is. I don't know why I've taken this on really, but there you go. I've got here the turtle and the fish. Now, if I've got time, anyone heard the parable of the turtle and the fish? If I've got time, I'll go through that later. So the freedom the Buddha gained when he became awakened, it was a mental one really. He was unaffected by growing old, getting sick. It didn't affect him mentally like it does us. He was an awakened being. He gained freedom from the fear of old age and death, we could say, putting it simply. And but he still had a body. Regardless of what some of the texts say, he, as far as we know, had a human body, and he got old and sick, like we all do, if we're lucky enough to get old and don't die in an accident, etc. So he was an awakened being with a human body. And this is termed traditionally as nirvana with remainder and nirvana without remainder. So nirvana with remainder is becoming an enlightened being but still having the frailties of a human body, whereas nirvana without remainder is, we can relate that to Parinivana. Several instances of the Buddha, we know he had his human frailties in the sense that his body was, well, starting to pack up really. He died at 80 years old, and he had backache, he had sickness, and final sickness of course killed him. So nirvana, it's described often as what it isn't. I've said it's the absence of greed, hatred and delusion, which is a good working definition really. And to say what it is a bit more tricky, but the founder of our movement, Sangharakshita, in a talk he gave decades ago, made a pretty good attempt at it, I think. 3 things, he said. So firstly, it is spoken of as a state of pure, clear, even radiant awareness. There is only one continuous, pure, clear awareness extending in all directions. It is an awareness of reality, of things as they really are, so it's a state of knowledge or wisdom. Secondly, it's a state of intense, profound, overflowing love and compassion for all sentient beings. Thirdly, it is a state of inexhaustible mental and spiritual energy, a state of uninterrupted creativity. That's a pretty good attempt, I think, at saying what nirvana or enlightenment or awakening actually is. Were you there, Ashaprabha, when he gave the talk? You might have been.
Which one was it? Enlightenment is experience.
I don't know. I don't know what the talk was called, but anyway, I think that's a pretty good attempt. So, meaning of Parinivana, and I said the nirvana with remainder, nirvana without remainder, and as a fire simile again. These 2 states. One traditional way of looking at it is between Nirvana, using the fire imagery again, a fire that has gone out but the embers are still warm. And Parinivana is a totally extinguished fire and the embers are cold. In the Dhammapada, there's a verse in there where Sangharakshita, his translation, he talked about the Buddha as being cool. And you think, wow, what's that mean? Without knowing a bit of the background. And it wasn't cool in the sense that, cool dude type cool. He didn't go around with a designer robe or, anything. It was because the embers had cooled. They'd gone out. And the fire had gone out and the embers were cooled. So that was the meaning of cool. Actually, it's quite a good way of describing it as a cool. It's cool, it might appeal to a lot of people. So, where are we? So what happens after Parinivana? I'm just going to quote from a sutta here, Questions of the Wanderer Vacchagotta, who wasn't actually a follower of the Buddha at the time. He was a wanderer. He was a sort of truth seeker, if you like. And he asked the Buddha a series of questions about the nature of the cosmos, etc. And also asked him what happened when an enlightened being or the Buddha died. And Vacchagotta said, what happens when a Buddha or an awakened being after death? And the Buddha wouldn't reply, because he said, well, that doesn't apply, Vacchagotta. Whether a Buddha does reappear or doesn't reappear, or does or doesn't reappear, that question doesn't apply. So Vacchagotta got totally confused by this. And the Buddha asked him a series of questions, and he said, if a fire were burning in front of you, would you know that a fire was burning in front of you? Yes. If you were asked the fire burning in front of you, dependent on what is it burning? It is depending on grass and twigs for its sustenance. And if the fire went out, would you know it had gone out? Yes. And if you were asked which direction has the fire gone? Has it gone to the east? Has it gone to the west, north or south? And Vacchagotta replied, well, that doesn't apply. And the Buddha said, well, exactly. It's like asking the question, what happens to a Buddha after the body dies? Actually, Vacchagotta became a follower of the Buddha after that. So, and I think one way of looking at this is that, when a fire has gone out, you don't say it's gone to the north, south, it's just gone out. And that's the same with an enlightened being. And you can look at this in terms of what a human being is described by. And some of you might have heard of the 5 skandhas, the 5 ways a human being can be defined, which is form, feeling, perception, volition, and consciousness. But the Buddha, being an enlightened being, has overcome all that. So he can't be described in any sort of meaningful way. So basically, you can't define what a Buddha is, so you can't really say what happens to him after death in that sense. There's no reference points. I came across a really good word, which I'll finish this with recently, that the word is unapprehendable. I can't even say it. Unapprehendability. Apprehendability, which is a 16-letter word because I counted them, and I think that's quite a good description. It's unapprehendable. How much have I got time to do the turtle and the fish? Or
go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, everybody wants to know the turtle and the fish. And this is a story, and I think it quite nicely. It's a little story I think brings home to us why we can't really appreciate what nirvana is. So, I'll just read it, or I'll perhaps skip through parts of it. But once upon a time there was a fish. And because it was a fish, it had lived all its life in the water and knew nothing whatever about anything else but water. And one day as it swam to the lake, it happened to meet a turtle who it had known before. "Good day, Mr. Turtle," said the fish. "Where have you been? I haven't seen you for ages." And the turtle said, "I've been on dry land." "On dry land?" exclaimed the fish. "What do you mean? What's that? I've never heard of such a thing." And the turtle said, well, you might not have heard of it, but it exists all the same." "Oh, come," said the fish. "Try to talk sense. What's it like? Is it wet? Is it all wet?" "No, it's not all wet," said the turtle. "Is it nice, fresh and cool?" said the fish. "No, it's not nice and fresh and cool." The turtle, must be a misprint, turtle. "Is it clear that light comes through it?" "No, light doesn't come through." "Is it soft and yielding so I can move my fins about in it and push my nose through it?" "No, it's not like that." "You can't swim in it." "Does it move in stream?" "No, it does." So, the fish couldn't just imagine what dry land was. So the turtle got a bit fed up and he thought, well, I'll just go back to dry land and leave this fish in ignorance. So does that give you some idea of why we can't describe... Good. So it's a nice little story. Anyway, I think I'll finish there on that note.
Well, thank you very much.
We're going to have